was like, wow, that's the greatest investment in the history of mankind. Well, let me tell you the rest of the story.
Someday, everyone will talk about the UFC.
This is the sport of the future.
The name and a
Old wooden octagon.
for $2 million.
Yeah, and I think we had like 11 guys under contract. He had sold everything off. The DVD rights, all the old library, the video game rights, the merchandise rights, all the things that you need to build a brand were gone. We didn't even own UFC.com. UFC.com used to be user-friendly computers.
The UFC is one of the most interesting case studies in sports. Today's we breaks down the unique factors that enabled them to build a business from $2 million to $10 billion. Almost 30 years ago, on November 12, 1993, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, UFC, held its first event in Denver, Colorado. The event was designed as an 8-man tournament that featured fighters from various disciplines: karate, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, wrestling, boxing, kickboxing, and taekwondo, with the idea that the winner would determine which martial art was superior. Fighters weren't separated into weight classes. They didn't wear gloves. There were no judges, no time limit, and the fights could only end one of 3 ways: by submission, knockout, or the fighter's corner throwing in the towel. Hell, even NFL Hall of Famer Jim Brown was an MMA analyst at the time. In simple terms, there were no rules.
TV guide after the first UFC. This is the bloodiest, most brutal spectacle in the history of mankind.
It was one of those things you kind of wanted to watch, but didn't know if you should be.
It was basically old marketing by the old owners just to make it sound crazy.
At the beginning was human cockfighting. It was. I mean, I've seen people repeatedly getting smashed in the face with a guy sitting on top of them. That's not a sport.
He said, what are you doing? You can't go put on fights that aren't regulated by the athletic commission.
There was no referee, there was nothing. It was terrible.
The owner basically said, trust me when I say this. I've been in business for a long time. You can't mess with the government. Tell the government you're not going to do what they want you to do. See what happens.
And to ban ultimate fighting, taking it too far.
The result? Almost 100,000 people bought the pay-per-view. But only the winner was paid, the arena was half full, and the media labeled the seemingly barbaric sport as human cockfighting. Fast forward nearly 3 decades, and the UFC is a completely different sport. The original founders, Art Davie, Rorion Gracie, Bob Merowitz, and Campbell McLaren, built up a solid fan base. They later implemented obvious rules like no biting, no eye gouging, and no headbutts. They even hired judges, created weight classes, and enforced the use of padded gloves. But there was just one problem. Despite working relentlessly to expand the sport domestically and abroad, the owners were unable to turn a profit. This is where Dana White and his friends Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta come in.
If you really know the history of the Fertittas and what they've built and what they've done, incredible businessmen. He and his brother Frank Fertitta own Station Casinos, which is the 3rd or 4th largest gaming company in the country.
So I'm sitting at the fight with Dana and I'm going,
Imagine if they did this and imagine if they did that. This thing could be big.
either there's something really wrong with us or this business just isn't being run the right way.
During a tense negotiation with former UFC owner Bob Merowitz in 2001, Dana White, who was working as a manager for UFC fighters Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell, sensed an opportunity. Merowitz frustratingly said, "There is no more money. I don't even know if I have enough money to put on one more event." Given the Fertitta brothers were billionaire casino owners in Las Vegas and fans of the UFC, White called them up. Within weeks, they presented a $2 million offer to buy the UFC. The catch? Fighting off bankruptcy for years, the UFC had already sold off all its assets, even its website domain. The trio would start from scratch, only receiving the UFC name. The Fertitta brothers funded the $2 million purchase price, and Dana White was named president of the operation and given a 9% equity stake in return. Next up, expansion. Since purchasing the UFC, Dana White and the Fertitta brothers have worked relentlessly to expand the sport over the last 2 decades. They quickly realigned weight classes. They secured sanctioning in important states like Nevada and New York. They spent millions of dollars marketing legendary fighters like Brock Lesnar, Tito Ortiz, and Ken Shamrock. But still, just 3 years later, they had already lost an additional $34 million, and growing. So how did they turn it around? There were obvious things like statewide regulatory changes, better fighters, acquiring smaller promotions, and bigger TV contracts. Still, in my opinion, the two largest contributing factors to the UFC's eventual success flew mostly under the radar to the casual fan. First, the UFC launched The Ultimate Fighter, a reality television show featuring up-and-coming MMA fighters living, training, and competing against each other for a six-figure UFC contract. Several TV networks were pitched on the idea, but they all rejected the concept. Only after Dana White and the UFC agreed to pay the $10 million production costs themselves did they finally get Spike TV to agree to produce and distribute the show.
News did not want the UFC. This wasn't allowed on pay-per-view. Porn is on pay-per-view. Our goal was to buy it and get it on free television. People thought that that was insane. Hey, when I came in here, it was war. And that's literally what I did. I'd stand yell on the phone, "F you, f you."
Dana, congratulations on your first show. That's got to feel good.
Thank you very much, James.
You know what I did? I went to the bookstore and I bought books on marketing. I bought books on finance. I bought books on PR. That was how I learned.
You have to understand what my job is. What my job is, in this day and age, I have to convince you to stay home on Saturday when you've been busting your ass at school all week, working, all the other things you got to do. You probably want to go out and meet some girls or take your girl out to dinner or go to a movie. I have to convince you to stay home on Saturday and pay $55 to watch my event.
The results were fantastic. Not only did the behind-the-scenes access connect future fans on a more personal level with the UFC fighters, but the heavyweight final between Stephan Bonnar and Forrest Griffin is still considered by many to be the greatest fight in UFC history. The craziest part? After averaging just 45,000 pay-per-view buys per event in 2005, the UFC broke 1 million pay-per-view buys less than 12 months after The Ultimate Fighter debuted.
Ended up doing a huge deal with Fox.
Because this is a really, really big day.
This is what I always wanted. What we have is a lot of content. We needed to get our content out there, and they spread our content across all their platforms. Fox is the #1 network in the country. And all those people out there that thought I was a lunatic 10 years ago when I said that this was going to be the biggest sport in the world.
Some still do. Some still do.
I know.
It literally saved the sport. In addition to The Ultimate Fighter, Dana White's approach to social media was just as important. While other leagues like the NFL and NBA were fining players for using social media, Dana White took the opposite approach. After seeing the success that fighters showing their personality through The Ultimate Fighter had on the sport, Dana White instituted a plan that paid fighters based on how effectively they used Twitter in 2011. The concept was simple. Dana White set aside $240,000 the first year and gave quarterly $5,000 payouts to the fighters that increased their percentage of followers the most. It might seem small, but over time, the results have compounded. Instagram followers: Conor McGregor, 39.9 million. Khabib Nurmagomedov, 28.4 million. Ronda Rousey, 13.3 million. John Bones Jones, 5.8 million. Nate Diaz, 4.8 million. Now, leagues like the NBA and NFL encourage social media use, and similar social media payout policies have been implemented by the PGA Tour and others.
A hardcore upbringing, you know.
I was the broke kid.
My dad was an alcoholic and was never around, and when he did show up, you didn't want him around. You know what I mean?
You know, I come from a single mom who worked hard and didn't have a lot of money.
So me and my sister were home a lot alone. One of the things I think about growing up alone is, you know, there's a lot of stuff that you have to learn on your own.
He just had this great personality. People were attracted to him. They wanted to be his friend. They like hanging out with him.
You went to school with Lorenzo, your partner now.
Me and Dana go way back to the time we were like 14, 15 years old. knew each other all through high school.
I got kicked out of high school a bunch of times. I was just never a school guy.
I mean, Dana has a high school education and that's it.
I was a bouncer. I did paving. I worked at the Four Seasons as a bellman.
My mother used to tell me that I was going to be just like my father and not amount to anything. And I was going to be pumping gas into my friends' cars. You know, my mom did a lot of shit like that. And I'm not saying that that's what drove me, but that didn't hurt. I always knew I wanted to be in the fight business.
Half the battle in life is figuring out who you are and what you want to do for the rest of it.
I was literally standing in the lobby one day and I'm like, what the hell am I doing here? And I walked out the front door and one of my good friends, who was the doorman, says, what are you doing? I said, I'm quitting. He's like, what? What are you gonna do? I said, I want to be in the fight business. He said, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life.
In the end, the UFC is one of the most interesting case studies in sports. They bought a failing business for pennies on the dollar and built up a loyal and engaged audience by promoting the personality of its fighters. Now, the business is worth between $9 billion to $10 billion. Dana White and the Fertitta brothers have put on a masterclass in marketing. While everyone is praising Formula One and Netflix for attracting new viewers through their innovative series, it's easy to forget that the UFC did it first. Remember, the combination of special access, great creative, and amazing storytelling can produce incredible results.